what is the appropriate attitude towards the future. And I would say, well, we could put past, present, and future in the same bin. Say, well, one of the things that you want to do is practice gratitude. That's one of the primary religious rituals, you might say, is the practice of gratitude. And you might say, well, my life is so horrible. What do I have to be grateful for? And I would say that's for better or worse, that's still a form of blindness, right? I mean, people can have very, very difficult situations, can be in very, very difficult situations. And it's in those difficult situations where the search for gratitude becomes something that is by necessity deeper and more difficult. But that doesn't mean it's not appropriate. No, and there is a very tight association between loving your enemy and being grateful in spite of the terrible things that occur in your life. I've been writing about the book of Job, and Job is a story of unjust suffering, fundamentally. God deems Job a good man, so we have it on God's word that Job is actually a good man, and then all hell breaks loose, partly because God makes a bet with Satan, which is, a hell of a thing to do, and says, do your worst. He's not going to turn on me no matter what you do. And so Job, despite his torment, he becomes very ill, he loses everything he has, his friends, he becomes ill in a way that's disfiguring. His friends come around and laugh at him and tell him that he's a bad man, and that's why all these terrible things have been happening to him. And it's brutal. And Job refuses to lose faith in himself. He says, look, I'm not perfect. But as far as men go, I've done what I should do, and I'm not being punished in some manner that's obviously related to my sin. It's more like the random play of tragic forces in the world. I'm not going to lose faith in myself no matter what. And I'm also not going to, his wife says, shake your fist at God, curse him and die. Because things have gone so badly for Job, she thinks that's all that's left to him, and he refuses to do that. So he maintains faith regardless of what's happened to him. And that's really the moral of the story of Job, which is that you are morally obligated to maintain faith no matter what happens to you. And there's a practical side to that. So imagine that God and Satan conspire against you. There'll be times in your life where it feels like that's happening. And then imagine that your reaction to that is to become bitter and resentful and hostile. Well, then whatever hell you're in, merely as a consequence of the confluence of tragic events, you have opened a whole other hell underneath it. The hell of bitterness and resentment and ingratitude. And that turns into the desire for revenge very, very quickly. If you think things are bad just because they're bad, you wait till you see how bad they can become if you allow yourself to be corrupted by your unjust suffering, right? And so I do think that this is the most practical possible advice that can be given to people, which is that you are morally required to maintain faith, to aim up, and to treat other people the way you would want to be treated, no matter what's happened to you. And that's a hell of a thing to say. And, you might say, well, that's impossible. Some people have such brutal lives that they're destined to be corrupt. But I would say that's not true. Like, I've met many people, particularly in my clinical practice, who had lives that were so brutal that you couldn't even listen to them without it like breaking you into pieces. Brutal, brutal childhoods of a depth of malevolence you can hardly conceptualize, who decided despite that they were going to aim up and they were going to maintain faith in themselves and the world. And so it's like that's on the table for people. Like when I was a kid, probably the time between 13 and 15 was the most difficult transition, but I saw that become older. By the time my kids are 30 now, basically. By the time my kids were young adults, I could see that transition into adulthood was the place where the difficulties were starting to mount. I think, perversely, that the therapeutic world has a fair bit to do with this, partly because therapists who are basically secular, liberal Protestants, that's a good way of thinking about them, tend to conceptualize mental health as subjective, right? It's like mental health is something you carry around in your head, like you carry around your identity. That's why we have these ridiculous ideas that you can just define your own identity. I am whoever I say I am. Well, obviously you're not, because other people have to go along with your game there, buddy, and they're either going to do that, they're not going to do it, or they're going to do it voluntarily, or they're going to do it by force. If they're not going to do it, you're screwed. If you have to use force, that's not going to work. And if you want them to do it voluntarily, then it's not going to be all about you. Obviously, even no 4-year-old can find someone to play with if he always gets to pick the game. Okay, so why might young adults be lost? Well, part of it is that they're thinking, I'm not trying to be judgmental of a whole generation. It's a form of thought. Your mental health isn't dependent on you. That's not the right way to think about it. I don't think you can be mentally healthy in the absence of a long-term stable relationship. So you have to be married. Let's make that part of the precondition for successful adaptation as a young adult. You have to be married. So you have to establish a relationship with someone that integrates sexuality, that's there for the long run. Because there for the long run is the same as sane. There for tomorrow, there for the next minute, that's not sanity, that's impulsiveness. That's aimlessness. They're the same thing. If it's all about what you want right now, or more accurately, all about what something in you wants this moment, that's the definition of immature insanity. You have to commit. So you commit to someone else, you commit to your family, you commit to your community. Like, there are multiple levels of identity that stretch out into the social world. And voluntarily adopting those levels of hierarchical responsibility gives you an identity. It gives you a purpose. It protects you from anxiety. It does that in all sorts of ways. Like, you said earlier that one of the things you do is seek for validation, and you related that to uncomfortable experiences you had when you were very young. Well, it might not be precisely that you're seeking for validation. You might be properly investigating how you should be embedded in a social hierarchy at every possible level. It's like, well, people think their mental health is something that they just carry around in their head, and that if they just got the way they looked at the world right, or if other people just played their game, that all of a sudden they'd be mentally healthy. It's like, there's no difference between thinking about yourself and being miserable. Technically, if you look at, you can group descriptive statements about yourself statistically. All the descriptors that are reflective of self-consciousness load on negative emotion.
Can you not think about yourself in a positive way?
Probably not.
Really?
Not. Well, let's take that apart. You like doing your podcast and you feel positive about it. Okay, but your podcast isn't about you. Right? So if you're thinking about how you're of utility to a broad number of people, maybe you would take some satisfaction in that, but that isn't exactly thinking about yourself, is it? It's thinking about the relationship you've established with other people, and it's a relationship of responsibility. Why do you like your podcast? You can pursue what you're curious about, but you wouldn't have to do that publicly. Okay, so why do you do it publicly?
For a few reasons. First one being that it keeps me accountable. That was one of the main reasons, that it kept me accountable, because I knew that if I didn't do it, if I wasn't rigorous and precise and aligned with what I'd said and done previously, that there was an external eye that's watching.
Okay, so, well, that's very interesting. So I would also say that's not exactly about you. That's about your ability to establish harmony between what you say and the way you act, and the expectations that an increasingly broad social community has of you as a consequence of what you say and how you act. Okay, that's not about you. That's about your nesting in a social hierarchy, right? And so I think you can, and then you might say too, well, maybe you're thinking about yourself when you're establishing an aim or a goal. Well, not if they're good aims or goals, because if they're good aims or goals, and I would say what good means technically is an aim or goal that will play out well in the medium to long term across a multitude of situations, including many, many people. So a solution that iterates across time, that is situation independent and that's broadly socially inclusive is a better aim, right? It's a higher aim because it integrates more. All right. Now, you might want to be setting up aims and you might be pleased about how you're progressing in relation to those aims. But if those aims don't have the characteristics that I just described, then if the aims have the characteristics I just described, they're not about you.